In the rolling hills of southern Ohio, past the winding creeks and whispering woods of Highland County, lies a story almost no one tells anymore. Not because it isn't important, but because someone, somewhere along the line, stopped telling it. This is the story of the Carmel Indians, a mysterious group of people who once lived quietly among the ridges near a small town called Carmel, and then seemingly vanished. But they didn't vanish into thin air. They were erased, rewritten, misclassified, forgotten. Today, only scraps remain, faded census entries, fragments of oral history, and surnames that carry the weight of identity across generations. In a place where identity was once survival, the Carmel Indians became a ghost people, hovering just outside the official record. This is the secret history of Ohio's lost tribe. And some say they may have been Melungeon cousins, part of a much larger American story of hidden ancestry, blended bloodlines, and a nation that has never quite known what to make of its mixed heritage children. To understand the mystery, we need to start with what little we know and what we've been told. The Carmel Indians were first noted in historical documents in the early to mid-1800s. They lived in a rural enclave in Highland County, a place not far from the edge of Shawnee territory, and just enough off the map to remain obscured by time. Early accounts describe them with a strange ambiguity. They were not quite Negro, not quite white, and possibly Indian. Their skin tones were varied, some dark, some olive, some light, and their hair ranged from straight to curly. In a society obsessed with racial classification, the Carmel Indians were difficult to define. Local whites often referred to them with euphemisms like colored mulatto, or sometimes just Carmel people, as if the very name was enough to separate them from everyone else. Some census records list them as free persons of color, while others use Indian. These labels change from decade to decade, making their trail harder to follow. The mystery grew deeper as scholars and genealogists began to look into their background. Who were they really? Where did they come from? And what happened to them? Some believe they were the descendants of Shawnee or Saponi Indians, pushed north from the Carolinas during the colonial wars. Others argue they may have been free black settlers who intermarried with local native women and European frontiersmen. Still others claim a connection to the Melungeons of Virginia and Tennessee, another triracial group whose origins remain hotly debated to this day. There are striking similarities. The Carmel Indians, like the Melungeons, were known for their insular communities, distinct surnames, and refusal to fit neatly into 19th century America's racial boxes. They shared an Appalachian landscape and perhaps an Appalachian fate, to be hidden in plain sight. And yet, unlike the Melungeons, whose name still sparks academic debate and cultural pride, the Carmel Indians have largely faded from the historical record. There is no federally recognized tribe bearing their name, no museum exhibits, no roadside markers. In fact, many Ohioans have never even heard of them, but they existed. The land remembers. The people, some of them still living, remember too. Local oral histories speak of the Carmel Ridge people or the Indian family down the road. Some elders recall stories told by grandparents, tales of herbal medicine, burial mounds, and a deep respect for the forest. Family Bibles still preserve old names, many of which match those found among other triracial communities across Appalachia. Names like Goins, Collins, Blevins, Mullins, and Gibson. These surnames crisscrossed in Melungeon, Lumbee, and Carmel Indian genealogies alike. Coincidence? Or something deeper? In this series, we'll go beyond the fragments and folklore. We'll dig through the censuses, travel the ridgelines, and listen to voices that still whisper from the margins. Because the story of the Carmel Indians isn't just a local mystery. It's part of a broader American reckoning with race identity and the legacies of erasure. So, join us as we uncover the long-buried truth of Ohio's forgotten tribe. This is the Crit Stories, and this is the first chapter of Melungeon Cousins, the history of Ohio's Carmel Indians. Who were the Carmel Indians, really? This question lies at the heart of our mystery, haunting genealogists, folklorists, and descendants alike. And like most mysteries rooted in America's early frontier, there are many theories, few certainties, and a trail littered with contradictions. To begin, we must step back in time. well before Highland County was settled by European Americans, to a period when the land was occupied by indigenous peoples such as the Shawnee, Mingo, and Miami. As colonization advanced in the 1700s, native groups were pushed, broken, and dispersed across the region. It was during these upheavals that smaller tribal remnants, such as the Saponi, Tutelo, and Akanichi, were believed to have migrated northward. The Saponi in particular, originally from Virginia and the Carolinas, are key to many origin stories of the Carmel Indians. Historians speculate that displaced Saponi families moved into Ohio and married into other marginalized groups. Freed black people, escaped slaves, and European outcasts such as indentured servants. In frontier zones, such alliances were often forged out of necessity, creating communities that didn't quite fit anywhere else. By the early 1800s, such a community had taken root in and around Carmel, Ohio. Rural, remote, rugged, the land offered both seclusion and survival. But what did outsiders see? To the dominant white society of the time, race was not just a social issue, it was law. A person's classification determined where they could live, work, and worship. It shaped whether they could vote, own property, or even testify in court. Into this rigid framework walked the Carmel Indians, unclassifiable by the standards of the day. They weren't enslaved, but they weren't fully free in white eyes either. Some were marked as colored, others as mulatto, and a few were even labeled Indian on early censuses. The same person might be listed under 3 different categories over 3 decades. What makes them especially intriguing is their consistency in place. Despite the shifting terminology, many of these families stayed rooted in the same area for generations. Surnames like Brooks, Goen, Burnett, and Branham appear repeatedly in Highland County's records, linking them to other triracial isolate groups across Appalachia. But perhaps the most provocative theory? That the Carmel Indians were related to the Melungeons of Tennessee and Virginia. The Melungeons, like the Carmel Indians, appeared in historical records as a people of unknown origin, often described with vague or euphemistic terms. They occupied isolated hollers in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. Early descriptions of both groups bear striking resemblances. Olive or reddish skin, European and native features, tight-knit family networks, and a mix of oral histories blending African, indigenous, and European stories. Some genealogists have traced shared surnames across the regions. Others point to common migration paths from the Carolinas through Virginia into southern Ohio. And more importantly, both groups were shaped by the same social forces: racial prejudice, cultural erasure, and the legal restrictions of Jim Crow. It's likely that they didn't call themselves Melungeon or Carmel Indian. Those names were probably assigned, first by outsiders, then accepted or reshaped by the communities themselves. Still, for the Carmel Indians, there are subtle differences. While Melungeons are relatively well documented thanks to decades of cultural revival and academic interest, the Carmel Indians remain in the shadows. Why? Some say it's because they assimilated, changing their names, lightening their stories, passing into whiteness when possible. Others say it's because they were repressed, boxed into a colored category that stripped them of tribal identity. Or perhaps they simply held their truths privately, passing down heritage not through government recognition or newspaper clippings, but through story, song, and silence. In the end, no single theory explains them completely. Were they Saponi refugees? Melungeon cousins? Free black settlers with native ties? The answer, frustratingly, may be yes to all. The Carmel Indians were not a single tribe in the modern sense, but a community woven together by shared survival, bloodlines, and memory. Their roots are tangled, just like America's. And as we'll explore in the next segment, it wasn't just their origins that made them complex. It was how they lived, quiet, dignified, and always just out of reach of the official record. Because some histories aren't written, they're whispered. To truly understand the Carmel Indians, we have to place them in a much wider and stranger category of American history. A category few people are taught about in school. A category known as triracial isolates. These were communities scattered across the American South and Appalachian regions, made up of people whose origins defied racial classification. They were part Native American, part African, and part European. And in a country where one-drop laws, segregation, and strict social boundaries dictate a person's identity, these communities were considered dangerous outliers. They were neither black nor white nor fully native, at least not in the eyes of the census takers, legislators, and local power structures. And so, they were pushed to the margins, geographically, socially, and politically. Among the best known of these groups were the Melungeons of Tennessee and Virginia. But they were far from alone. There were the Lumbee of North Carolina, the Brass Ankles and Red Bones of South Carolina, the Wee Sorts of Maryland, the Ramapo Mountain People of New Jersey, and yes, the Carmel Indians of Ohio. Each of these communities had their own names, customs, and oral histories, but they all shared certain traits. Insular family structures, with frequent intermarriage among a limited pool of surnames. Ancestral claims of Native American heritage, usually denied by the state. A history of being mislabeled or reclassified depending on the political climate. And perhaps most tellingly, a reputation for being mysterious or different to outsiders. Let's look closer at the Melungeons, perhaps the most studied of these groups. They lived in the Appalachian Highlands, primarily in Hancock County, Tennessee, and parts of southwestern Virginia. First documented in the early 1800s, they were described with terms like dark-skinned, foreign-looking, or Portuguese, though they had no connection to Portugal. The term Melungeon itself may come from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and that's exactly what they were, a blend of African, native, and European ancestries. Yet they weren't a tribe in the traditional sense. They didn't speak a separate language. They had no formal government or treaties. What they did have was a shared experience of exclusion. Some Melungeons were classified as free persons of color and barred from owning land or attending white schools. Others were targeted under anti-miscegenation laws, and many simply faded from public view, choosing to assimilate, pass as white, or relocate to cities where no one knew their past. The parallels to the Carmel Indians are striking. In Ohio, the same patterns occurred. A group of people labeled mulatto or colored, despite their insistence that they were Indian, a community that remained in the same region, Carmel and Highland County, for generations. A list of surnames like Goen, Burnett, Branham, and Nichols that also appear in Melungeon genealogies. Some researchers believe these groups were actually extensions of one another, connected by migration, marriage, and mutual necessity. As native tribes were displaced and as free black individuals sought safety, they formed new communities in marginal lands, the mountain hollers, swamp edges, and river valleys that others didn't want. And from those margins, they built survival cultures, hidden in plain sight. But here's the tragedy. The more America demanded racial clarity, the more these triracial isolates were pressured to erase themselves. Some communities emphasized their native heritage to avoid being classified as black. Others denied African ancestry altogether, and still others kept silent, passing into whiteness when possible or simply disappearing from the record. By the early 20th century, eugenics laws and racial integrity acts further erased these identities. In Virginia, the infamous Racial Integrity Act of 1924, pushed by Dr. Walter Plecker, systematically reclassified thousands of Native Americans as colored, denying their tribal identities and rewriting birth certificates by force. Though Ohio didn't have such an aggressive policy, the effects were similar. By mid-century, most official records stopped acknowledging the Carmel Indians as a distinct group. They were folded into broader racial categories, stripped of recognition, voice, and heritage. And yet they endured. Today, descendants of these triracial communities are rediscovering their pasts. DNA testing, online genealogy, and oral history revival are helping families reconnect with their origins. And scholars are beginning to take seriously what local elders have long known, that identity in early America was not binary. It was complex, fluid, and constantly negotiated. The Carmel Indians may have been Melungeon cousins in blood, but more importantly, they were part of a shared survival story, a testament to the resilience of people who didn't fit the mold. In our next segment, we'll take a closer look at life in Highland County itself. What was daily life like for the Carmel Indians? What traditions did they hold on to? And what pressures forced them to let go? Because understanding their culture is the key to understanding their disappearance. Highland County, Ohio. tucked into the foothills of the Appalachian Plateau. This was the land the Carmel Indians called home. To an outsider, it might have seemed like just another patch of rural farmland, green fields, dirt roads, barns weathered gray by time. But for the Carmel Indians, it was far more than that. It was refuge, identity, and survival. The community that took root here in the early 1800s was small, tight-knit, and deeply private. Families often lived in clusters, forming small settlements near Carmel and surrounding townships like Marshall, Paint, and New Market. Some homesteads remained in the same family for generations. Sturdy one-room cabins or modest frame houses, surrounded by gardens, chickens, and sometimes hog pens. They lived simply, not by choice but by circumstance. Most were farmers, laborers, or seasonal workers. The land was rocky, the soil unforgiving, but they made do. They grew corn, beans, squash, what some elders remembered as three sisters crops passed down from native traditions. Others worked as farmhands for wealthier white landowners, paid in meager wages or bartered goods. But even as they struggled to get by, the Carmel Indians preserved a way of life that was distinct. Stories from descendants speak of home remedies and herbal medicine, knowledge likely rooted in indigenous and African folk practices. Elders were known to use sassafras, golden seal, and wild cherry bark to treat colds or fevers. They rarely saw doctors, partly due to cost, but also because they relied on each other. Their spiritual life was similarly syncretic. Though many Carmel Indians attended Christian churches, often segregated or black congregations, they also retained elements of folk belief. Some stories describe dreams and visions, signs in nature, and the power of certain rituals or spoken blessings. One defining feature was the strength of family bonds. Households were often multi-generational. Children were raised not just by parents, but by grandparents, aunts, cousins, and neighbors who might as well have been kin. Oral history, stories told by the hearth, was the primary way culture was preserved. The stories were usually cautionary, moral, or historical. Our people came from the mountains, one elder recalled hearing as a child. We've always been different. These stories often included hints of identity, that they were part Indian or that their ancestors had come over the mountains from Virginia or the Carolinas. Rarely was race discussed directly, but it lived under the surface in every interaction, every schoolyard taunt, every suspicious glance from a census taker. Because in a segregated society, the Carmel Indians didn't fit. Many were not allowed in white schools. In some districts, they attended separate colored schools or denied education entirely. Public services were scarce. Churches sometimes welcomed them, especially Methodist or Baptist congregations, but often relegated them to the back pews or denied them membership outright. Worst of all was the social ostracism. In 19th and early 20th century Highland County, to be seen as other was dangerous. The Carmel Indians faced discrimination, suspicion, and stigma. They were often accused of being shifty, unclean, or untrustworthy, labels rooted not in truth, but in racism and fear of the unknown. Some white neighbors refused to trade or associate with them. Marriages between Carmel Indians and white residents were discouraged or outright banned. In court cases, their testimony was often dismissed, especially when going against a white plaintiff. For many Carmel Indian families, survival meant silence, not drawing attention, not claiming too much, not asking for recognition. And yet, despite all this, they endured. Their identity may have been blurred on paper, marked mulatto, colored, or simply unknown, but within their homes, they knew who they were. They passed it on quietly, person to person, memory to memory. Even today, some descendants speak of the rules of being Carmel Indian, rules about who you could marry, how you handled outsiders, and the stories you could share, rules about never correcting a census taker, about keeping things inside the community. Of course, not all families follow the same customs. Like many mixed heritage communities, the Carmel Indians weren't monolithic. Some leaned into native traditions. Others identified more with black ancestry, especially in the civil rights era. And some simply faded into whiteness, especially those with lighter skin and more European features. This splintering only increased over time as social and economic pressures mounted. In the 1940s and 50s, Young people began moving to cities like Cincinnati and Columbus. Factories offered better jobs than farms. And in the city, no one knew your past, an attractive offer for those weary of being marked other. As generations passed, much of the Carmel Indian culture faded. Homes were abandoned. Land was sold. Graveyards were left to overgrowth. And with no formal tribal recognition, no legal framework, the community essentially vanished from the record, but not from memory. In the next segment, we'll examine the erasure more closely, how local governments, census takers, and state officials helped erase the Carmel Indians from official history. And we'll look at why, even today, many Ohioans have never heard of them, because silence, too, is part of the story. By the mid-20th century, the Carmel Indians of Highland County, Ohio, had begun to vanish, not just physically, but legally, bureaucratically, and culturally. This was not a sudden event. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, calculated process of erasure, the kind that happens when identity becomes inconvenient for the people in power. It started with a seemingly harmless tool, paperwork. Every 10 years, the U.S. Census marched across the country, clipboard in hand, and demanded answers. What is your name? Where were you born? What is your race? And for many Carmel Indians, there was no acceptable option. They weren't allowed to say Indian, not unless they were part of a federally recognized tribe, which they weren't. And if they tried to insist, they'd often be reclassified by the census taker's own judgment. So, in the early 1800s, many were labeled free people of color. In the 1850 census, some families were marked as mulatto. In the 1900s, it might read colored or simply Negro. And by the mid-20th century, as racial categories hardened and federal records demanded uniformity, these families were often grouped under black populations, regardless of how they saw themselves. Why? Because Indian wasn't just an identity. It was a legal category. And in Ohio, unlike in places with federally recognized tribes, being Native American without formal recognition meant being invisible. You couldn't claim land rights. You didn't have access to tribal programs. You weren't taught in textbooks. And most importantly, your children were not allowed to inherit that identity in public. To understand this erasure, we need to look at the broader American pattern, especially in places like Virginia, where laws like the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 codified race into rigid binaries. You were either white or colored. No room for ambiguity. No room for mixed heritage. And definitely no room for indigenous communities who had survived through intermarriage and migration. Dr. Walter Plecker, the architect of that law, ordered the destruction and alteration of thousands of births, marriage, and death records, reclassifying any family he suspected of passing as Indian back into the colored category. His legacy infected the census records across the East Coast and Appalachian states. And while Ohio didn't pass a law exactly like Virginia's, the effects were similar. County clerks often followed the federal trend. Anyone who didn't clearly fit the white category was nudged into colored, especially if they were poor, had dark skin, or bore surnames associated with Melungeon or Triracial communities. Over time, the Indian checkmark disappeared. School records followed suit, then church rolls, then land deeds. Eventually, so did the public memory. But how does a people disappear from history? In part, it happens through official silence. Government documents that never mention Carmel Indians, textbooks that never name them, historical markers that overlook them, and genealogical records that reduce them to unknown or worse, non-white, no further information. It also happens through shame and survival. In communities where being labeled black meant second-class citizenship, many Carmel Indian families chose to blend in, to pass for white if their appearance allowed, or to identify as black if it helped avoid conflict. Some moved away entirely, north to industrial cities, where no one asked questions. Others stayed in Highland County, but stopped talking. They raised their children without the old stories. They stopped identifying themselves publicly as Indian, and slowly, the identity that once defined the community became a whisper. This is a common story for triracial isolate groups. The Melungeons of Tennessee went through the same. So did the Redbones of Louisiana and the Weesorts of Maryland. In every case, erasure didn't come from war or disease or forced relocation. It came from paper, policy, and prejudice. And yet, something remained. In 1980, a genealogist named Arlene Eagle published work linking the Carmel Indians to Melungeon ancestry. Others began to trace family lines, finding overlapping surnames, migration routes, and DNA markers. Highland County locals started whispering again, this time with curiosity, not shame. Who were these people? And what happened to them? And then came the internet. In the 2000s, online genealogy forums buzzed with activity. Carmel Indian descendants began to find each other. They shared stories, photos, baptism records, and family Bibles. DNA testing opened new doors. Suddenly, people who thought they were black or white or just American discovered native roots buried deep in their family trees. For some, this discovery was thrilling, a chance to reclaim a lost heritage. For others, it was painful, a reminder of what was taken, ignored, or hidden. But in either case, it was a resurrection of memory. The Carmel Indians may never be federally recognized. They may never have a reservation, a tribal council, or a language class. But their story still matters. Because what happened to them isn't an anomaly. It's part of the American story. A story of categories, survival, and silence. And now, a story that's being told again. In our next segment, we'll shift focus to DNA and genealogy, the science and technology helping Carmel Indian descendants rediscover who they really are and how it's changing the way we understand race and ancestry in America. In the past, the Carmel Indians of Ohio were defined by stories. Whispers passed from one generation to the next. Tales of native ancestry, whispered marriages, strange migrations, and skin tones that didn't fit clean racial lines. But for generations, those stories were discounted, dismissed, or simply ignored by census takers, by local historians, and sometimes even by their own descendants. But today, we live in a different world. A world where the past can be traced not just through oral tradition, but through genetic code. DNA doesn't lie. In the last 2 decades, genealogy has gone digital. Platforms like Ancestry.com and 23andMe have turned the once specialized field of family research into a mainstream movement. Millions of Americans have swabbed their cheeks or spit in a tube, eager to unlock the secrets of their ancestry. For descendants of the Carmel Indians, those results have often been surprising. In family after family, people have been told they were just white or just black, discovered traces of Native American DNA, often clustered in regions like the southeast U.S., particularly in areas historically home to tribes like the Saponi, Catawba, and Powhatan. In many cases, these results align perfectly with old family stories that have been long buried or dismissed. Some even found matches with known Melungeon descendants in Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, suggesting that the connections between these groups weren't just cultural, but biological. Take the surname Goins, a common thread in both Melungeon and Carmel Indian genealogies. Geneticists and genealogists have traced members of the Goins family from the Melungeon strongholds in Hancock County, Tennessee, through Kentucky and into Highland County, Ohio. DNA evidence supports that migration path. Another frequent surname, Norris, also appears in multiple mixed-race communities along the Appalachian corridor. Families with that name often show a combination of sub-Saharan African, European, and Native American markers, hallmarks of Melungeon-related ancestry. But the significance goes beyond individual family trees. In studying these patterns, researchers have uncovered a broader truth. Triracial isolated communities, like the Carmel Indians, were not isolated accidents. They were part of a wider cultural and biological network, forged by shared experiences of marginalization, displacement, and resistance. These communities often formed in the same way. Escaped or freed African Americans found refuge in native villages. Indigenous families pushed off ancestral lands, moved deeper into mountains, and poor Europeans, often Scotch-Irish or Portuguese, intermarried with both. Over time, these groups became distinct people, living on the margins of white society, not fully accepted, but not fully erased either. The Carmel Indians are part of that tapestry. Their genetic echoes are proof of centuries of survival against the odds. And now, science is helping us put the pieces back together. Of course, DNA is not everything. It's a tool, not a definition. It can tell you where your ancestors were, but not who they were. It can't capture stories. It can't describe the smell of a wood stove in a one-room home near Carmel, Ohio. It can't tell you what it felt like to be turned away from a schoolhouse or to overhear a neighbor call you colored behind your back. But it does offer validation. For many Carmel Indian descendants, DNA results have provided the first external proof that the stories they were told as children, the ones they were warned not to repeat, were real. It's also empowered a new generation of researchers. Independent historians, armchair genealogists, and curious descendants are now piecing together family maps that span states and centuries. Online groups have formed, on Facebook, Reddit, and Ancestry forums, where Carmel descendants compare matches, share stories, and rebuild their fragmented history. Some are even working to establish formal recognition, or at least historical acknowledgement, from local and state institutions. It's a long road, and recognition, especially federal tribal status, is notoriously difficult, but the movement is growing. What's clear is this: the mystery of the Carmel Indians is no longer a mystery to those who share their blood. In fact, DNA has helped expose the myth of racial purity that has haunted American history for centuries. People are beginning to see that identities aren't always clean lines on a census form. They're layered, messy, complex, just like the stories of the people who live them. And in many ways, the Carmel Indians represent something profoundly American, a story of mixture, migration, and quiet perseverance. In the next segment, we'll shift the focus back to Highland County today. What do people remember about the Carmel Indians? What's been preserved? And what's been forgotten in the churches, cemeteries, and schools of the region? Because history doesn't only live in DNA. It lives in places. Some stories are buried, not in archives or government records, but literally in the ground, in overgrown cemeteries at the edge of cornfields, in churchyards surrounded by barbed wire, in the worn pews of Baptist churches that haven't heard singing in 50 years. To understand the Carmel Indians, you don't need to just read their history. You can walk through it if you know where to look. Welcome to Highland County, Ohio. Tucked into the rolling hills of southern Ohio, Highland County today is a quiet place. Farmlands stretch across the landscape. Pickup trucks hum down rural roads. Small towns like Hillsboro and Carmel feel frozen in time. But if you talk to the right people, the oldest locals, the cemetery caretakers, the genealogists, you'll find that the memory of the Carmel Indians is still here, faint but persistent. One of the most enduring markers of the Carmel Indians is found in cemeteries. Scattered throughout Highland County are small family plots, often unmarked, sometimes completely abandoned. Names like Goins, Watts, Norris, Shepherd, and Freeman appear on the tombstones, often weathered and barely legible. Some of these graves date back to the early 1800s. Others are more recent, burials from the 1940s or 50s. In many, there's no birth year listed, no death year, just a name and a stone. Sometimes not even that. In at least 3 different cemeteries near Carmel, researchers have identified dozens of graves belonging to known descendants of triracial isolate families. These cemeteries serve as silent proof that the Carmel Indians were real, rooted in the soil of southern Ohio. They lived, died, and were buried here, sometimes in family sections that were separate from both white and black cemeteries. But why are so many of these graves unmarked? It's a painful question with a complex answer. Many Carmel families lived in deep poverty. They didn't have the money for engraved headstones. Some feared vandalism or exclusion. Others deliberately kept their identities quiet, even in death, part of the long legacy of survival through silence. And yet, these graveyards remain sacred ground to many descendants today. Some come from out of state, Kentucky, Michigan, even the Carolinas, to trace their family trees in the dirt. They leave flowers on stones that bear their grandmother's name. They kneel before graves that say colored, in faded engraving, but know, in their hearts, that the person buried there told stories of Cherokee or Saponi blood. Churches are another piece of the Carmel puzzle. In the 1800s and early 1900s, several small churches served the local community. Records are spotty, but oral history and property documents confirm that at least 2 of these churches were founded and attended primarily by triracial families. One such church was located near Carmel, nestled between two hills. The building is long gone, but descendants still refer to it as the Indian Church. In these churches, people weren't concerned with racial classifications. They prayed together. They sang hymns passed down from both Appalachian and Native traditions. They baptized their children in nearby creeks and taught them to be proud, quietly proud of who they were. Unfortunately, as desegregation laws took effect in the mid-20th century, many of these community spaces disappeared. Some churches were consolidated, others were abandoned altogether. And just like that, another layer of the Carmel Indian identity dissolved into the past. But Highland County didn't forget everything. Ask the right elder, and you'll hear it. She had high cheekbones, said she was part Indian. They always kept to themselves, good people, just didn't mix much. We weren't allowed to talk about it back then. My mother would hush me if I asked. These offhand comments tell us what the official records won't, that the Carmel Indians were remembered not just by name, but by presence, by stories, by the feel of their skin, the shape of their eyes, the rhythm of their voices. In the Highland County Historical Society, some researchers have begun quietly gathering oral histories. Elderly residents recall children being separated by skin tone at school. They remember families that lived on the edge of town, who didn't fit the mold of black or white. Some even admit to lost branches of their own family trees, kin who went Indian and never came back. And just like that, the past begins to breathe again. Local memory matters, not because it's always accurate, but because it fills in the cracks that history books leave behind. It tells us not just who the Carmel Indians were, but how they lived, how they were seen, and how they disappeared. The goal now is preservation. Cemeteries need protection. Churches need documentation. Stories must be recorded before they're lost to time. Because every headstone, every dusty hymn, every whispered recollection adds another brushstroke to the portrait of a people who refuse to vanish. In our next segment, we'll look beyond Highland County to how the story of the Carmel Indians fits into the larger tapestry of triracial isolated communities across America. Because their story is not just local, it's national. The story of the Carmel Indians may seem like a unique chapter in a small town's past, tucked away in the hills of southern Ohio, known to only a few descendants and historians. But in truth, their story is not an outlier. It's part of a larger hidden map, a map of triracial isolated communities, groups of people who existed outside the tidy racial categories of white, black, and Native American. These communities weren't exceptions. They were part of a widespread pattern that stretched across the United States, particularly in the South and Appalachia. The Carmel Indians of Ohio are just one node on this forgotten web. Let's zoom out. In the deep hollows of eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, there are the Melungeons, arguably the most famous triracial isolate group in America. Their name alone conjures mystery and theories abound. Portuguese sailors, Turkish soldiers, sub-Saharan Africans, Sephardic Jews. But like the Carmel Indians, the truth is more grounded and more complex. The Melungeons emerged from intermarriage among Native Americans, particularly the Saponi and Catawba, free and enslaved Africans and European settlers, especially those from the Scotch-Irish and Portuguese communities. They lived in relative isolation, often in rugged mountain communities where outsiders rarely ventured. Names like Goins, Collins, Gibson, and Freeman pop up frequently, many of the same surnames found among the Carmel Indians. Coincidence? Not likely. Historians and genealogists have traced migration patterns that suggest members of these Appalachian triracial groups slowly migrated northward, some settling in Ohio, Indiana, and even Michigan. The reasons? Escaping persecution, seeking economic opportunity, or simply moving closer to relatives who had already made the journey. The same names, the same complex ancestry, the same quiet marginalization. But the Melungeons were only the beginning. In Virginia, there were the ramps and the issues, terms often used derogatorily to describe mixed-race groups that didn't fit within the black-white binary. In North Carolina, the Wissorts and Brass Ankles maintained distinct cultural identities, often married within their own circles for generations. Further south, the Redbones of Louisiana and East Texas emerged from similar roots. Native African and European ancestries blending in communities that refused to adhere to the rules imposed by race-based hierarchies. Even in Delaware, there were the Moors, a group of light-skinned people with claims of African and Native descent who maintained separate schools and churches until well into the 20th century. Each of these communities had their own names, their own dialects, their own stories, but there were consistent patterns. They often lived in rural areas, apart from white or black populations. They were self-sustaining, with internal networks of marriage, trade, and kinship. They were subjected to suspicion and discrimination, often being forced to pass as white, black, or native depending on the prevailing power structures. And many of them left few official records, either by choice or by the erasure of government institutions. What makes the Carmel Indians especially fascinating is their geographic position. At the northern edge of this cultural map, in many ways, they represent a northern frontier of the triracial isolate world. They are a missing puzzle piece that helps connect the dots between Melungeon territory in Tennessee and similar communities in the Midwest. This is not just anthropology. It's not just genealogy. It's American history, the kind that rarely makes it into textbooks. Triracial isolate communities challenge the idea of fixed racial categories. They expose the fluidity of identity and the invention of race as a social construct. They show us that real people, real families, existed in the liminal space between categories, not just as exceptions, but as enduring communities. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate how people adapt. When society said, "You don't belong," these communities built places where they did. When laws classified them as colored, they created their own churches, their own schools, and in some cases, their own cemeteries. When racial violence threatened them, they retreated into the hills, or into silence. The Carmel Indians are part of that lineage. And while they may not be as well known as the Melungeons, they are just as significant. Their story deepens our understanding of America's racial past, not as a straight line, but as a web of hidden lives, intersecting stories and defiant survival. In today's world, where identity politics dominate headlines, these communities offer a valuable lesson. Identity isn't always clear-cut. It's not always visible on the surface. Sometimes it's whispered in kitchens, buried in graveyards, or hidden in the curves of a cheekbone. Sometimes it takes centuries to hear the full story. In our next segment, we'll explore what cultural practices and beliefs the Carmel Indians may have retained, language, rituals, foodways, and how those echoes continue to shape the lives of their descendants today. Because even when people are forgotten on paper, their spirit lives on in how they lived. If you go looking for the Carmel Indians in textbooks, you'll find almost nothing. No tribal charters, no official languages, no battlefields or treaties. To the bureaucrats and census takers of the past, they barely existed. But listen closely in the kitchens, in the gardens, in the songs of Highland County, and you'll hear whispers, hints of a culture that was never fully erased, only tucked away in plain sight. Because the Carmel Indians, like many triracial isolate communities, held on to their identity not with flags or proclamations, but through everyday acts of continuity. The way they cooked, the way they prayed, the stories they told their children at bedtime. This is where history becomes something more than names and dates. This is where it becomes living memory. Let's start with food. Ask older descendants of Carmel Indian families about traditional meals, and you'll hear descriptions that don't fit neatly into either Appalachian or Southern cuisine. Fried cornmeal cakes, not quite hoe cakes, not quite fry bread. A fondness for forage foods, poke greens, wild berries, dandelion root. Dishes that combine indigenous knowledge with African and European ingredients. Some families use homemade herbal teas brewed from plants passed down for generations. Sassafras root for blood cleansing, peppermint and goldenrod for headaches. The recipes weren't written down. They were remembered, mother to daughter, elder to child. These foodways, simple as they seem, were acts of preservation. They whispered, "We came from somewhere else, and we're still here." Then there's spirituality. Many Carmel Indian families were deeply Christian, especially within Baptist and Methodist traditions. But their religious practices often carried unspoken echoes of older belief systems. Some descendants speak of their parents refusing to attend church services at white or colored churches, and instead gathering privately for home-based worship. Prayer circles, where hymns were sung in call-and-response style, possibly an echo of African or native communal rites. Certain practices, like blessing the corners of home or leaving tokens on graves, suggest lingering indigenous beliefs beneath the Christian overlay. One descendant recalled her grandmother lighting a small fire outside during family illness, whispering over it. Another spoke of never throwing salt over the shoulder, but instead burying it in the ground where no one walks. Are these just Appalachian superstitions, or fragments of cultural memory? That's the complicated beauty of triracial communities like the Carmel Indians. Culture was passed through fusion, not formal tradition. When survival demanded secrecy, culture found a way to live between the lines. What about language? Unlike some Native American tribes, the Carmel Indians did not retain a distinct spoken language. By the time most families had settled in Highland County, English was dominant. But researchers have noted that certain phrases, cadences, and storytelling patterns within triracial communities resemble Southern indigenous oral tradition more than white settler speech. Long-winded storytelling with poetic metaphors. Heavy use of allegory, animals, and symbolism. For example, the phrase, "he walks like a snake," wasn't just a colorful insult. It implied spiritual duplicity, a warning of someone not to be trusted. Some descendants say their elders warned them of owl dreams or night walkers, terms found in native spiritual lore as symbols of bad omens or ancestral messages. Again, nothing written, nothing cataloged, but still something preserved. And finally, there are the names. The surnames of Carmel Indian families, Goins, Freeman, Norris, Shepherd, Watts, Collins, were more than just identifiers. They were clues. DNA evidence, oral traditions, and cross-regional genealogies have tied many of these families to Saponi, Catawba, Cherokee, and African-American roots. Some families used nicknames or pet names that never appeared on legal documents, but were deeply meaningful inside the community. A woman named Susanna Goins might be known as Turtle Sue by her kin, a nod to a clan animal, a symbolic role, or a family joke. These internal identities were never meant for outsiders. They were for the circle, for the people who remembered. So, what remains of the Carmel Indian culture? Not monuments, not tribal councils, but something arguably just as powerful, living fragment of food, faith, language, and love. Traditions that adapted across generations while quietly retaining pieces of their origins. And in today's world, many descendants are starting to reclaim those fragments. They're digging into family trees, taking DNA tests, creating Facebook groups and oral history projects. They're visiting those forgotten cemeteries, brushing moss off stones that carry their blood. They are saying, "We were here. We still are." In our final segment, we'll ask the most urgent question. What now? What does it mean to reclaim a lost or suppressed identity in the 21st century? What responsibilities come with remembrance? Because the story of the Carmel Indians doesn't end in the past. It's just beginning to find its voice. We've journeyed to the misty hills of Highland County, Ohio, unraveling forgotten people's past. We've followed names through censuses, whispered stories through backroads, and unearthed the living echoes of a culture once thought lost. And now we arrive at the present, the crossroads between memory and identity. The story of the Carmel Indians is not just a mystery to be solved. It's a legacy that demands to be remembered, not as a curiosity, but as a vital thread in the American tapestry. But what does it mean to reclaim an identity that was never officially recorded? One that was actively hidden for generations to protect families from persecution, erasure, or worse. The answer lies not just in the past, but in the people carrying that past forward. Across Ohio, Kentucky, and beyond, descendants of the Carmel Indians are rediscovering their ancestry. For many, it starts with a simple question. Where do we come from? That question leads to family Bibles, to dusty attics, to elders who speak in half-whispers. Then the archives, DNA tests, genealogy groups. Each discovery, however small, feels like a sacred artifact, a photograph, a marriage license, a strange surname that keeps showing up on both sides of the family tree. Some descendants have gone further, forming online groups and heritage initiatives. These aren't formal tribal movements, But communal efforts to share stories, compare family lines, and preserve what remains of a shared cultural experience. Others are writing books, hosting local history tours, petitioning libraries to archive Carmel-related records. They are giving voice to a past that was denied one for too long. But as this revival gains momentum, it brings with it difficult questions. Who gets to claim this identity? Is it determined by blood? By community acceptance? By lived experience? Some descendants feel a deep connection to the Carmel Indians despite being raised outside the community. Others grew up knowing something was different, but never had a name for it. And still others feel conflicted, torn between a longing to belong and a fear of romanticizing or appropriating a forgotten culture. These are not easy questions, and perhaps they aren't meant to be. What matters most is the act of remembering, of standing against the silence imposed by history, of saying, our ancestors lived, they mattered, and so do we. The story of the Carmel Indians is also a reminder of what America really is, not a country of tidy racial lines, but of blurred borders, a place where identity was forged in hidden valleys, where resistance meant survival, and where culture was carried not in books but in hands, mouths, and hearts. By remembering the Carmel Indians, we challenge the dominant narratives that have told us for centuries that race is binary. That heritage is simple. That stories must be official to be true. But the truth is the Carmel story, and those of other triracial isolated communities, is essential to understanding who we are as a nation. It is the story of people who didn't fit, who weren't allowed to fit, and who, instead of vanishing, quietly built lives of resilience, resourcefulness, and resistance. And now, their descendants are writing the next chapter. There is no single way to reclaim identity. For some, it's planting the same herbs their grandparents once used. For others, it's holding ceremonies, sharing stories, or building educational platforms. For many, it's simply acknowledging the ancestors aloud, honoring those who couldn't say their names in public but made sure their children survived. The Carmel Indian story is no longer just a local curiosity in southern Ohio. It's a national conversation about memory, belonging, and the right to define one's own history. So where do we go from here? We continue listening. We keep asking questions. We keep honoring complexity in a world that often demands simplicity. And we remember that the past is not dead. It's not even past. It lives in surnames, in recipes, in photographs, in the quiet conviction of those who choose to carry it forward. The Carmel Indians may never have had their story written in the official pages of American history, but thanks to their descendants and all those willing to uncover hidden truths, they are no longer silent. They are being remembered, not just with curiosity, but with dignity. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. This has been the Crit Stories. If you've enjoyed this journey into America's hidden history, please like, share, and subscribe. New mysteries, new truths. Until next time, stay curious.